Chapter 5. A United Europe, Stepping Stone to Global Peace. We have now embarked upon the last decade of the second millennium since Christ's birth. Already the 1990s are being hailed as the most exciting and encouraging period in human history. Never before has the prospect of world peace and prosperity seemed so promising, and never before has the tide of international public opinion taken such a dramatic turn from near despair to joyful hope, as it did just before entering this new decade. How quickly the unbelievable events of the last few months of 1989 accelerated and fed upon one another. Even the most astute political observers and media commentators were taken totally by surprise. An astonished world watched as unbelievable changes swept Eastern Europe. Words failed to describe what was happening. One journalist simply said, "The party's over, the Communist Party." Even to suggest such a possibility only a few short months before would have seemed ludicrous. How abruptly everything had changed. The seemingly permanent Iron Curtain mentality was suddenly transformed into candid openness and cooperation between East and West. Winston Churchill had coined the phrase with his famous statement in 1946. Quote, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has fallen across the continent." Unquote. It had become a fixture, part of the harsh reality of life that no one anticipated would ever change. Then, with surprising ease, 43 years and many deaths and desperate escapes later, the evil curtain was no more. The quote-unquote absolutely impossible continued to unfold day after day in breathtaking progression. As one TV commentator, who was covering the historic meeting between Soviet President Gorbachev and Pope John Paul II, and the Gorbachev-President Bush summit, which immediately followed, said with awe, quote, "Astonishing changes are completely transforming the world at such a rapid pace that we can hardly keep up with them." Unquote. Francis Fukuyama of the U.S. State Department called it, quote, "not just the end of the Cold War, but the end of history as such." Unquote. The front cover of the December 11, 1989 Time magazine, reporting on the Bush-Gorbachev summit, displayed their pictures with this auspicious caption, quote, "Building a New World." Unquote. Gorbachev's glasnost and perestroika, viewed with considerable suspicion in both East and West, had been fermenting for months. After the historic summit with President George Bush, perestroika suddenly exploded with irresistible force in the Soviet Union and all across Eastern Europe. The impossible was actually happening. Oppressed citizens ecstatically dancing on top of the Berlin Wall and brazenly tearing it down, while border guards stood back and observed it all with approving smiles? Unbelievable! Yet there it was on TV for the incredulous world to witness. Gorbachev declared, quote, "Things are truly changing, and in the most radical way. People are having an impact on politics, and if anyone thinks they want changes only in one region, they are very much mistaken." Unquote. In rapid succession, oppressive totalitarian Marxist regimes, seemingly invulnerable, collapsed in the face of peaceful demonstrations. Hundreds of thousands of students, joined by citizens from all walks of life, who until that heady moment had been afraid to even imagine themselves in such a role, took to the streets, waving banners and demanding freedom. They were not to be denied, and the results were dramatic beyond comprehension. Picture the spectacle. Top leaders of communist parties across Eastern Europe, which had for decades condemned capitalism and pretended to represent equality for all, being exposed at last for shocking criminal corruption. Totalitarian tyrants who had ruled by terror and intimidation were suddenly being arrested by non-communists taking over the leadership of heretofore communist countries. Fresh evidence of the basic selfishness and hypocrisy of the human heart, though hardly needed, was carried in newspapers around the world. Quote, "Wandlitz, East Germany. Massive iron gates seal off the luxurious quarters here, where senior officials of the East German government and Communist Party have made their homes for years. Throughout the country, the old leaders are being angrily condemned for plundering public accounts and socking away their illicit fortunes in foreign banks, of building lavish, personal retreats with public money. Since the party's grip on East Germany began to unravel in October, previously unimagined luxury has been disclosed. New reports of scandalous activity surface almost daily, and they have had a powerful impact on ordinary East Germans. For, under state socialism, everyone was supposed to have lived more or less on the same scale. The reaction has been fierce. The newspaper of the National Democratic Party commented that, quote, millions of people in this country feel they have been seduced and victimized, unquote. A university graduate student complained, the question of corruption means the dissolution of the Communist Party. We are seeing reality as it is. A worker in East Berlin said, it's disgusting the way the party leaders lived, and meanwhile they were preaching to us to work harder for socialism. In the village of Rottelbrode, in the Harz Mountains, former Mayor Edeltraut Tiello was brought before an ad hoc court, stripped of her title, and charged with personal enrichment at public expense. She is now taunted and threatened in the streets. Such situations are said to be commonplace in much of the country." Unquote. Picture the Warsaw Pact meeting in mid-December 1989, following the Bush-Gorbachev summit, its representatives being told by the Soviet president that all of the rules were now changed. They were free to go their separate ways. Most of the old guard, solidly entrenched in leadership positions for decades, were missing at that historic gathering. Those few remaining who were present knew they were on the way out. Head still held high, Nicolae Ceausescu, Romania's despotic ruler for 24 tragic years, sat in that Moscow meeting, scowling at the newcomers, hiding his bewilderment and fear behind a fragile mask of business-as-usual bravado. A few days later, he would ruthlessly order his troops to machine-gun citizens, peacefully begging for democracy, killing thousands in his desperate bid to retain his tyrannical rule. Within 36 hours, however, toppled from power by his own army, Ceausescu fled by helicopter from his flaming palace, was captured, and with his wife Alina, was executed by firing squad on Christmas Day 1989, the last Warsaw Pact dictator to fall. All across Eastern Europe, the seemingly impossible events that millions imprisoned behind the now shredded Iron Curtain had scarcely dared even to dream about had come to pass, and with a swiftness that was breathtaking. Democracy was invading the communist world. Toward the end of 1989, in response to pleas for advice from the emerging new leadership, Paul Weyrich led a team of experts to Eastern Europe to provide training in, quote, the fine points of Western-style politicking, unquote. Often called, quote, one of the ablest nuts-and-bolts political operators active in the conservative movement, unquote, Weyrich and his team encountered in Moscow what he calls, quote, the most incredible experience of our lives, unquote, when they worked with members of the inter-regional group in the Supreme Soviet. Said Weyrich, quote, these deputies made no bones about their preference for private property, free markets, and the restoration of religion, and asked penetrating questions about the techniques of political action in the United States, unquote. The destiny of Earth's 5 billion-plus inhabitants was taking a dramatic and gigantic leap in an unforeseen direction. Apparently, by some mysterious decree, the time had come for such transitions to occur. Or was there perhaps a more sinister explanation? Some analysts were convinced, and many still are, that glasnost and perestroika were a deliberate ploy to set up the West for its final destruction. The McIlvaney intelligence advisor warns that, quote, Gorbachev and his brilliant KGB scriptwriters and military planners have decided to trade nominal control over the Eastern Bloc satellites for the neutralization of Western Europe and the destruction of the NATO military alliance. The script calls for America and Western Europe to be allowed to take over the financial burdens of Eastern Europe, unquote. Sounding an alarm that Alexander Solzhenitsyn and others have also voiced, Donald S. McIlvaney argues, quote, from Lenin to Gorbachev, the communist leadership has talked of the necessity of using wealthy finance capitalists, for example, like the Armand Hammers, the David Rockefellers, to help finance their world revolution. So the communist leadership is willing to go along with the reunification of Germany and then Europe, to grovel before their Western benefactors and smile and bow and humbly admit their mistakes and ask for financial and industrial help to change their ways. But at a point in time, this writer believes in the mid-1990s, the Soviets, the greatest masters of deception in history, will double-cross their liberal Western capitalist benefactors and will attack the United States." Unquote. McIlvaney goes on to assert that the reunification of Germany and the neutralization of Western Europe through a great peace offensive have been on the Kremlin's drawing boards for years. The apparent democratization of Eastern Europe is the Soviets' master ploy to deceive the West into disarmament, and thus to set up their final move for world domination. This theory is given further plausibility by no less an authority than John Lengzowski, who was Director of European and Soviet Affairs at the National Security Council from 1983 to 1987. Lengzowski brings the following disquieting facts to our attention. Quote, "While the West looks with wonder and astonishment at the ostensible breakdown of one communist regime after another in Eastern Europe, this observer confesses to having a certain sense of unease. In 1984, Anatoly Golitsyn, one of the most prominent defectors ever to leave the KGB, predicted a false liberalization in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, whose reforms would be so dazzling that the West would be incapable of retaining a consensus in favor of a strong defense. Among the scenarios Golitsyn envisioned, Gorbachev was then a faceless Politburo apparatchik, the demolition of the Berlin Wall, a coalition government in Poland involving solidarity in the Church, Alexander Dubček's return to government in Czechoslovakia, a Soviet Dubček succeeding Leonid I. Brezhnev, amnesty for dissidents and the return of exiles and a place for Andrei Sakharov in government. A deception the magnitude of Golitsyn's scenario is well beyond the scope of the Western imagination. But so was the deception performed by Moscow's trust operation in the 1920s, which involved the creation of a false opposition and which succeeded in deceiving 11 Western intelligence agencies for several years." Unquote. Let us suppose that Golitsyn was right, and the democratization of Eastern Europe began as an incredible deception. It would nevertheless appear that events have gone far beyond the point where any human agency is any longer in control. Communism's Humpty Dumpty would seem to have fallen so far and shattered so badly that even the fabled KGB will not be able to put it back together again. We will have to wait and see. One thing, however, is certain. Much of Lenin's evil empire has gone up in flames, and the unlikely arsonist who struck the match was none other than the presumed leader of world communism, the Soviet president himself. It is not unlikely that Gorbachev used the Kremlin's long-standing plan for a false liberation of Eastern Europe as a cover for his own scenario. Otherwise, it is inconceivable that he could have lasted so long without being ousted by the other members of the Politburo. Could it be that Gorbachev's real plans involve personal ambitions far beyond the office he now holds? Already a poll reveals that if an election were held today, Gorbachev would be voted in by a wide margin as head of a united Western Europe. It is not unlikely that his ambitions go beyond even that exalted position. The skeptics remain convinced that it's all a trick. It would seem, however, that events have gone too far for the Kremlin ever to turn the clock back, even if Gorbachev were ousted from power. And who would want to take over his job under present conditions? With a pope at his side, the Soviet president bravely and resolutely pledged the unthinkable. Quote, "We have now decided, firmly and irrevocably, to base our policy on the principles of freedom of choice. Having embarked upon the road of radical reform, the socialist countries are crossing the line beyond which there is no return to the past." Unquote. The iron-fisted rule of Soviet communism, which held its subjects by force, is metamorphosing into a free society. No longer need the world tremble for fear of Marxist totalitarianism moving west. Suddenly, mysteriously, and contrary to all of the experts' forecasts, democracy is moving east. Not only have the oppressive regimes of Eastern Europe fallen, but one by one they are moving as fast as they can in the direction of Western-style democracy. More significant, perhaps, than even their public pledges of cooperation, was the air of brotherly love and trust that Bush and Gorbachev exuded toward one another in the joint news conference after their historic 8 hours of talks together at Malta early in December 1989. Newspapers around the world blazoned the headlines, "New Trust Infusing U.S.-Soviet Relations, Friendship, Hope Replacing Suspicion." Andrei V. Nikiforov, editor of the influential Soviet journal USA, summed it up. Quote, "The ideological confrontation is over. That in itself is a historic shift of immense importance for our two countries. We now act, in fact, from the premise that we have common interests with the United States on many issues. Problems remain from the era of confrontation, but they are not the obstacles they once were." Unquote. That trust seems to have grown with each summit meeting that Bush and Gorbachev have had since then. Many former Cold War antagonists on both sides are confused. A Kremlin official remarked, "Some of the old-timers left at the foreign ministry wander up and down the halls, shaking their heads and mumbling to themselves about all the changes. What is changing is not just our relations with the United States or the West, but our whole understanding of the world, of our place in it, of our own country, and of ourselves." The significance for the fulfillment of Bible prophecy of the remarkable historic events we have just outlined, and which continue to unfold, should be clear. With the coming of democracy to Eastern Europe, the door is now open to something that no one could have even imagined: the possibility that former communist nations could now join their one-time enemies from the West to form a much larger united Europe than previously envisioned. Such a union could end the threat of the repeated wars that have ravaged that continent since it was first inhabited by primitive tribes. That this development could also represent a giant step toward the false peace under the Antichrist is at least a very strong possibility. Furthermore, the expansion of the EC to include Eastern Europe would appear to necessitate a revision of the most widely accepted prophetic interpretation concerning the revival of the Roman Empire. In the next chapter, we will consider one of the most amazing prophecies in Scripture: Daniel's interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's vision of the great image. The 10 toes on the image's feet of iron mixed with miry clay, Daniel 2, verse 43, have generally been interpreted to signify that the revived Roman Empire would consist of 10 Western European nations. Already in trouble because the EC includes 12 nations, with the possibility of others from the West joining, the addition of yet more countries from Eastern Europe would effectively scrap the 10 nations in Western Europe theory. In fact, it never did make sense to equate the revived Roman Empire with Western Europe, because that was only a fraction of the ancient Roman Empire. The door seems to be opening to a global unification of nations and thus global peace. If the entire world is united, then we may be certain that the Antichrist will not rule over only a small part of it. So we move another step closer to understanding that the only sensible interpretation is a literal one of John's declaration concerning the Antichrist. "And power was given him over all kindreds and tongues and nations, and all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him, whose names are not written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world." Revelation 13, verses 7 and 8. While we dare not be dogmatic, it would appear that the prophesied revival of the Roman Empire actually does signify a worldwide empire to be ruled by the Antichrist. We will give further reasons for that assumption later. According to the Bible, the Antichrist will exercise his power ruthlessly, destroying 3 nations, Daniel 7, verse 8, devouring and breaking in pieces, chapter 7, verse 19. It certainly won't be a worldwide love-in, yet his kingdom will also have the elements of a voluntary association and democracy at first, and he will be worshipped, which certainly indicates some affection and trust. The whole picture remains a mystery. Of course, a multitude of questions arise. One wonders why this revival of an ancient empire must occur at all, and why the Roman Empire rather than one of the others. What are the characteristics of ancient Rome that are so important that they must be present in the world of the last days? The answers to these and other questions will become apparent only as we examine the relevant Bible prophecies and take a brief look at related history and current events. In that process, we will discover that the revival of the ancient Roman Empire of Caesars and popes is one of the most important events prophesied for the last days. It is no less significant than the return of Israel to her land and the rapture of the church. In fact, without it, Christ's second coming could not occur at all.